So we have a happy declaration in Psalm 66, and we have a glorious truth in Luke 15. This man receiveth sinners and eateth with them. And that word receive means to receive unto yourself. And so since I was a sinner, I was eligible for the truth of that statement to be received. And it's a long time ago since he received me, 46 years ago, this coming February the 10th. Then we have a solemn warning in Proverbs chapter 29, he that being often reproved hardeneth his neck shall suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. And there's a reason for me reading that verse, because it played a very important part in my conviction of my sins. As I've mentioned, my father left this country in 1910 as a lad of 17. I understand they had a dirt floor in the house back then, and the little pigs they put in the parlor at night, and he said, I never had a pork chop in Ireland. They were too poor. They ate turnips and potatoes a lot and had one egg on Sunday. I think those conditions have long passed away. His mother died at the age of 36 when he was 7, and his big sister raised him, and his older brother was a boxer, and my dad was the punching bag for practice. And my grandfather was one of the champion fiddlers in the north of Ireland. So there's a lot of music in our family. That's how I happened to meet my wife, playing bluegrass music, which is Anglo-Saxon in origin. But he left and he went to the United States, and he saw an English woman from Newcastle on Tyne at a dance along the Ohio River. And first he landed in New York, and the first thing he bought was a pair of brass knuckles and a revolver. So you know what my kind of a rough character my father was. The only comb he ever used was his 4 fingers, but he was a good father to me. But he got a job in New York for a couple of months, then moved to Steubenville and got employed in the steel mill there. And one night at a dance along the Ohio River, he saw a nice-looking little girl from Newcastle on Tyne. And he said to his companions, I like her looks, I'm going to marry her. That's a lot of presumption, isn't it? And she was a lady, and my dad was rough. They say opposites attract. Well, if that's true, it was true in this case. And in 2 weeks, they were married. That wasn't a very long engagement. And they were married 1 week, and she threatened him with divorce because he come home drunk, celebrating the fact that he was now married. And she says, Bob Surgenor, it's either me or the boys. Make up your mind to that. She was just a little stick of dynamite, 120 pounds, and he was 230 pounds, a big, broad-shouldered man that I feared very greatly in my mischievous years. And so he listened, and they went to hear a man called Billy Sunday. He was quite a dramatic kind of a preacher. Billy Sunday, you wouldn't let him in the hall, I'm sure, here. But if he had been preaching here, within 15 minutes he'd be standing on top of here preaching, and maybe waving that chair in his arm, and with his coat off, and then his tie off, and he's one of those kind of preachers. And my dad got kind of enthused, and they hit what they called the Sawdust Trail and reformed. And my dad was a Presbyterian, and my mother was a Methodist. And all she ever heard in England was that you gradually grow into becoming a Christian by your good life. Well, they joined the Sawdust Trail, but that didn't seem to make much difference in their life. And one day there's a knock at the door, and it was the brethren from the Gospel Hall up Adams Street Hill. And they're building, they had rented an empty house along the Ohio River, not too far from the hall, but it was an outreach. And they were going around and asking people to come, and they come to my parents' door, and they said, will you come down and help us sing? We need some good singers in our meeting, and we'd appreciate if you came. You know, I think there's a bit of wisdom in taking that approach. You remember the Lord, he said, give me to drink. He asked a favor, didn't he? of the woman at the well. And so they went and they discovered this, something that had never been taught in the Presbyterian Church in Kells or in the Methodist Church in Newcastle. They had never been taught this, that except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God, and that new birth takes place at a definite time in your life. And that's what slew them. My mother examined herself and she says, here I am, and I can't look back to any time when I was born again, when I saw, well, that I was a sinner going to hell, and Christ died for me. And as a result of those cottage meetings, they were reached and saved. And the brethren said, almost immediately after they told them they were saved, they said, you need to be baptized. And you come up the hill and sit in the back and watch the Lord's Supper this coming Lord's Day. And so they sat in the back in that meeting in Steubenville. All the brethren in that meeting were steel workers. And my father said, this is it. There's something real about this place. Something real about it. And so they were baptized and added to the testimony. Then later, around 1913 or 1915, my father moved to Cleveland to work in the open hearth steelworks and for Republic Steel. And so that was their experience. While they were in Steubenville, the doctor told my mother she would never be able to have any children, and so they adopted a little girl out of the orphanage, just an infant. Her name was Lula. Well, anyways, years later, my mother, they were in the old Addison Road Assembly in Cleveland. That assembly was composed of 250 in the fellowship and just the same number in the Sunday school, with 14 elders and 6 full-time workers. Robert McCracken, a brother of William McCracken, was one of the evangelists connected with that assembly. My mother, in 1928, maybe the end of 1927, started to have problems with her stomach. And she said to one of the sisters, she said, I don't know what's wrong with me lately. It feels like something's moving inside of me. It was me. It was me. And the woman said, Mrs. Surgenor, I think you're going to have a baby. And my mother got angry at her, of all the nerve to talk like that. Well, it was true. So I was born September 2nd, 1928. By cesarean birth. My mother was small, and so I was the only real child she would ever have. And maybe you think I was spoiled in my bringing up, but I'll tell you this, my father was a real disciplinarian. And he had a razor strap. They didn't have electric razors then, I wish they had. But he had a razor strap where he sharpened a straight edge razor, and it was hanging right in the kitchen next to the sink. And he used it more on me than he did the razor, I'll tell you that, because I was very mischievous. But you know, at the age of 2 in the winter, he took me out for a little walk, and he didn't put boots on my little shoes. And I contracted double pneumonia in both lungs. And of course, back then they didn't have the medicines they have today, penicillin and antibiotics and all this fancy stuff. Didn't have that. And so I was confined to the hospital. And my fever went to 107. And I never realized that causes brain damage. And when I found that out, my wife says, that explains a lot of things about you. But anyways, 107. And the doctor said, you're going to lose him. You're going to lose him. And they packed me in ice. Now, I'm only telling you what they told me. I don't have that good of a memory. But they packed me in ice. And that whole assembly of 250 people gathered together to pray. And you know what my mother prayed? She said, Lord, you've given me a child. The only real child I'll ever have. And if he's going to grow up to die in his sins, just take him. But if he would grow up and get saved and be used of thee, spare him to me. That's some prayer. And of course you all know God answered that prayer. In 1932, times were kind of tough. But my dad paid the fare for my mother to go to Seattle, Washington, which was 2,800 miles from Cleveland on the train. And I was just a boy of 4 years of age, and I got to go. And the reason I'm relating that is I can remember that trip at 4 years of age, and I can remember first act of mischief. I had other acts of mischief before that, according to my mother. But I remember this one. And we stayed with my aunt and my cousin. She had a Persian cat. And the thing was lying by the fireplace one night. And my aunt had clothespins like I'd never seen before. They had springs on them. You could push the back and the thing would open. And pretty tough springs, too. And I got one in each hand, and I snuck up to the cat, and I put one on each ear and let them go. Well, you see something. I'll tell you, that thing screamed and tore around the house, and my cousin was crying, and I'm laughing. I thought, this is great. But my mother wasn't laughing. And I was immediately taken to a bedroom and given a good spanking. But you know, out of it all, I thought the spanking was worth it. I really did. I thought it was worth it. Well, that was my first act of mischief. Then in 1939, my mother took me on the train again, and we went to Atlantic City, or Ocean City, New Jersey. That was where my other aunt lived, and she was married to a brigadier general in the Salvation Army, and he had charge of the whole Salvation Army for the United States of America. His name was Newby, and my aunt was a major, but they were saved. And that's one sister of my mother's that was really saved people. They're fine, godly people. And my mother and her sister were sitting on the boardwalk by the ocean side there, the Atlantic Ocean. And, of course, I wasn't very old. I was 11 years of age. And I said to my mother, can I wade in the ocean? I'd never seen the ocean before in my life. You know, although we live on Lake Erie, but the ocean was different. There's waves coming in. And they had a roped-off area that, I would say is farther out from the shore than the back of that hall there. And that's where the people could swim, and it was roped off. They had posts down in the ocean floor, and they had these ropes all the way around. Swimming area, but I couldn't swim. I didn't know how to swim. And my mother said, you can wade along the shore, but don't go deeper in your ankles. Well, her and her sister were busy gabbing, on the boardwalk, and when they weren't looking, I just got my hands on the rope and I went all the way out. And then a wave come along, and I lost my grip. And that was my first swimming lesson. It was either swim or sink, and I'm floundering. And I remember a couple of waves going over me. That's all I remember. I was washed ashore. Of course, I wasn't that far out, but I was washed ashore. And the lifeguard was pushing on my back when I come to, and there's people standing around, and water was coming out of my nose and my mouth, and there was my mother, and she was bending over me. And as soon as I opened my eyes, she was crying. She said, Robert, if you'd have drowned, you'd have been in hell. I'll never forget that. And that kind of spoke to me. And I thought, no, if I had drowned, I'd have been in a place where there's no water, and where there's weeping, and where there's gnashing of teeth. And that spoke to me. I think that's the first time I really was ever convicted of my condition and my danger. And it's true, isn't it? Can't we all say like David said to Jonathan, truly as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there's but a step between me and death. Just a step between all of us and death and eternity. At the age of, that same year later on, Albert Joyce and Herb Harris came to Cleveland, and there was quite a stir. Quite a number professed. And there was a very sentimental story told. And I believed the truth of the story and told everybody I was saved. That was at the age of 11. But my desires hadn't changed. I still wanted to do things behind my parents' back. And I still wanted to sneak off to the movie theater. I used to sneak off to the movie theater just as a little boy. They never knew. They didn't know. I'd go and sneak away and see a movie sometimes on Saturday, and then I'd tell my mother I was playing baseball down the field with the boys, And but at any rate, 2 weeks later, I just come to the conclusion I had no love to read the Bible. It had no appeal. And I couldn't pray. I didn't know, I just didn't feel like getting down praying. Of course, my father read the Bible. We read the Bible every day in our home at supper time, and he prayed. But I had no desires. And I still hated to have to go to meeting. And at least I was honest with myself. And I went and told all the Christians that I had told that I was saved. I went and told everyone, I made a mistake, I'm not saved. I was only 11. I told them that I wasn't saved. Then God again spoke to me at the age of 13. On a Friday after school, I had a job working in a grocery store, and that was just at the age of 13. But I had a job working in a grocery store. I think it was 10 cents an hour or something like that, carrying out groceries. But I wanted a quarter Friday. I wanted some money for Friday night. I wanted to buy something, I forget what it was. And I asked my boyfriend, and there's others stand there, his name was Eddie Stockton. I said, Ed, can I borrow a quarter, and I promise to pay you back Monday? Oh, sure, he said. And he gave me the quarter. And the other boys started laughing. They said, kiss your quarter goodbye. You've given it to Surgenor. You'll never see it again. I says, honest, Ed, I swear I'll give you that quarter on Monday. He says, well, I know you will. But he never got it. I'll tell you why. He went swimming on Saturday, dove off a diving board in a private lake, and hit a rock with his head. Drowned. Monday, our whole class from school was excused. We got in the school bus with a teacher. We drove to the funeral home. There was my boyfriend that I borrowed the quarter from. What was left of him, just his clay body. And the whole classroom sat down there. And this fella come out, I'd never seen him. He looked so funny. He had a dress on and he didn't have a tie. And, he looked funny. I'd never seen anything like that. I was so sheltered, from that sort of thing. He was a clergyman. And so he read out of a little prayer book. I peeked, and he was reading his prayer, mind you. And I thought, what kind of a thing is this? And then he read a little verse. I think it was, the Lord is my shepherd. And then he said, little Eddie is now an angel in heaven. And I could not stand up here and publicly tell you what that boy got into. I mean, he was a rare one. He was wicked, really wicked. And I said to myself, regarding the preacher, I said, you hypocrite. That's just, and I felt like getting up and telling him he was a hypocrite, but I didn't dare do it. But, and he preached them right into heaven. But I knew differently. He died suddenly, too. And in the classroom, we all got up one by one, and we filed by the casket. And I looked into his face. I thought, oh, God, if that was me, I'd be in hell. And I thought, Ed, I really believe you're there right now. And that made deep impressions on my soul. Here, I got a job in a little factory at the age of 14 after school. I saved up $75, and my dad, he really shouldn't have done it, but he let me buy a little motorcycle. It It's a great little one, 30 cubic inch Indian Scout. It was a used one, of course, for $75. And you know, I didn't have the thing a month, and I rammed it into the side of a car. And there's two difficulties with that. The first one was it was the principal's car of the school. That didn't help me with him. And then I woke up on the sidewalk, and they took me to the hospital. No broken bones. And my dad walks into the hospital. He says, "Let's go home," and got me in the car. And I'm worried about my motorcycle, but it was pretty well ruined. The next year, I borrowed a friend's motorcycle and had a bad accident with that. Well, it wasn't too bad, but I rammed into the rear of a car on the highway, and I landed on the roof of the car, and my girlfriend landed on the trunk of the car. That's how hard we hit the back of that car. But you know, no broken bones, and I wasn't even hurt. I'm just telling these things to show you how the Lord preserved me. And at that age of 16, we were into a lot of things. I lived in a fairly affluent neighborhood. Our house consisted of 6 bedrooms and 4 baths and all that sort of thing. My dad had a good job. He was over 250 in the open hearth works in the steel mill. And so the mayor of Cleveland lived 2 doors away from us, and Newton D. Baker, Secretary of State for the United States, his widow lived across the way from us on the other side of the golf course. Anyways, it was a nice neighborhood, but you know, those children were a wee bit affluent, and my dad was pretty strict with me, but we got into fooling with guns. Mr. McShane asked me over the phone when I told him I was finally going to come over here, he said, "Are you afraid of guns and bombs?" I says, "Not a bit. Not afraid of a gun. I've had guns put on me. But you know, one day we were shooting the guns, ricocheting the bullets off the highway to hear them whistle. You know, a bullet, nice whistle to it. If you aim the gun just at the pavement, and then it flattens out, you know, it has a beautiful whistle as it goes back up in the air. Of course, it was in the country, and we never thought about maybe a car coming down the road. Too silly to think of that. But you know, I was bending over the back of the car. The car's this way, you know. I'm bending over the back, loading up my rifle, and my boyfriend was on the other side, and he decided to shoot over the trunk of the car, and just as he shot, I stood up when he let go. And all I felt was gunpowder stinging my side of my face. And so I couldn't hear out of that ear for about an hour. But, you know, I don't know where the bullet, I know it didn't go in here and go out the other side. It missed me. It missed me. And you know, the thought struck me. Here's the first thought that struck me. You were almost in hell. Almost in hell. At the age of 15, I got nothing like this man over here, but I did get a pilot's license. A student license, flying a little plane that went 85 mile an hour, you know, an Aranca Chief. Well, I started flying that thing around, and I had some experiences with that, probably not as many as our brother McElwain, but his experiences were when he was saved, and I wasn't saved. But anyways, I was putting along, going north and out of the northeast, flying towards the southwest, right into the 4 o'clock sun. That was a Mitchell bombers and Thunderbolt P-47 fighters in formation, and they were going to go over the Cleveland airport. It was the Cleveland air races, and they were going to go over the field in battle formation. And I saw them coming, you see, at 1,500 feet, and it was pretty hard to judge if they were above me or below me, and I didn't know what to do, so I just kept putting along. And you know, the bombers went right under that little plane, and the P-47 Thunderbolts went right over that plane, just about tore the wings off that thing. That thing was all over the place, and I was only 1,500 foot above the ground. Then we had another experience with the plane. When I was 18, I got my private license so I could take other people up for a ride, and I called up a fellow in the middle. I says, "I'll come over to Strongsville and pick you up and take you up for an airplane ride." And you know, I could never get my father in the airplane. I tried to get him in the airplane to pay him back for all the spankings. I really wanted to do a stall on him and stuff like that, but he was too smart of an Irishman to get in that plane with me. But anyways, we're flying over to the other side of town, and all I had was an altimeter and an RPM and a compass and a gas gauge. That was my instruments. And no parachute. And up ahead there was a snow squall. And I thought, that thing doesn't look like much. I'll just go through it and be out of it in a minute and on my way, instead of going 15 miles around. And so I entered the snow squall. Well, I got in that thing, I didn't know where it was. Whether it was upside down, sideways, or what. I had no turn and bank indicator, I had nothing like that. All I knew how high I was off the ground and what my RPMs were and how much gasoline I had. That's all I knew. And what direction I was going. And so I don't know what to do. So I started to go down. I thought if I can get down, then I can get myself oriented and see the tops of the houses. And the snow was just swirling all around going by. Well, it was coming at me at 85 miles an hour. I couldn't see a thing. So I went down, down, down. I saw the roofs of some houses. And then all of a sudden, on my left, a red light went by the window. And two more went by on this side. Oh, what the world's that? Well, I found out what it was. There's the towers on the southwest side of Cleveland, all these big radio towers with red lights blinking, and I was flying between them. I didn't even hit a guy line. So you see, it makes me think of a scripture, the Lord preserveth the simple. And I really think it was the prayers of God's people for me. I can really sing it truthfully. Preserved by Jesus when my feet made haste to hell, and there should I have gone, but thou hast done all things well. And one other occasion, with a bunch of radio equipment, the thing was overloaded with weight, and I had a friend in the back. He was dual control, it was a stick thing, it didn't have a wheel. It's a real old, dinky kind of an airplane, and cloth covered besides, didn't have metal size, it's cloth. And we went to land in Butler, Pennsylvania, and I had to abort the landing because someone was landing towards me. And so I gunned the thing, and I blew a spark plug out. And he knows what that is. Brother McElwain knows. And so my RPM dropped, and I'm running on 3 cylinders instead of 4, and trying to clear the high-tension lines alongside the highway. And we just got over those, and there was a federal law against flying alongside the Veterans Hospital right next to the airport. Federal law, no federal law. We were looking in the windows of that, trying to get back to the airport, and we had to go around and over some woods and get back in the field. And I told my friend, whatever you do, don't pull back on the stick because it'll stall the plane, will go right down. And we're mushing. And the raw gas, you could smell it in the plane every time that one piston come up. The raw gas was coming out of where the spark plug blew out. And I thought, well, all we need is one spark in this thing and we'll be incinerated. We'll go up, wouldn't we? We'd have gone up. At any rate, we started over the woods and the tail wheel was bouncing off the top of the trees. It was just bouncing like this, just mushing along. I don't know how fast we were going. Maybe we were only going 45 mile an hour. The plane, I think, stalled out at 42 or 43 miles. But we got back to the field. Isn't that wonderful? We got back to the field and made it in. But I was a trembling young man. I was really scared. And again the thought struck me. You'd have been in hell. And then I got a high-powered motorcycle, too, when I was 18. I went to work in the steel mill when I was 18 to make big money. And my father was my boss. And maybe you think that was great, but it wasn't so great because he was harder on me than anybody else in the mill. But I made good money, and I bought a nice the biggest motorcycle I could get, but it would only go 108 mile an hour. But we used to drink a bit. Maybe I shouldn't tell you that, but we go down the highway and scrape the running boards on the highway and to throw sparks. Just go down the road like that, me and a couple other fellows. Just carrying on. Just tempting God. And yet the Lord preserved me through all of my, capers. Through all of my capers. When I got the job in the steel mill, I was fresh out of school. Well, of course, before that, just before me and two other boys, we got in an old 36 Oldsmobile, a club coupe, and with 3 pup tents, Army surplus pup tents, and we thought we'd go see the West. And so we drove out west, and we went to Boulder Dam, Hoover Dam, same thing. And it was 127 in the shade at that time there. It's out in the desert. And so we were swimming around in that lake. That lake, 25 feet down, you could see the pebbles at the bottom. The water was so crystal clear. And the dam, of course, formed the lake. But I got sunstroke towards the evening. We went into the little town to see a movie on how the dam was constructed, and I passed out. And instead of my boyfriends taking me to a doctor, they threw me in the car, and we headed for Pomona, California, across the desert at night, me with sunstroke and vomiting and sick as a dog. And I remember pulling into Carson City, which was a ghost town, and we were going to put up our pup tents. And I remember a fellow saying, "There's a mountain lion on the loose here with cubs. I wouldn't advise you to camp out here." So on we went, and we got to a little store out in the middle of nowhere, big fat Indian lady in there, and she said, "I can remember you in bad way." And so, I'll tell you, do you know what she did? She got a little pan of water, and she put about a half a pound of tea in it. Oh, that was good tea to drink, wasn't it? And she boiled it till it was like tar. Then she cooled it, and she painted my whole body. Do you know what that did? It took away the effects of the sunburn. And years later, they come out in the States with this new invention, tannic acid, to relieve the symptoms of sunburn. That old lady knew about that way back in 1946, that old Indian lady. Well, then when we come back, I got a job in the mill, and my first 2 weeks there, I saw a fella get his head cut off. He had been through the Second World War, and he had come back, and he was a carpenter, and he was up on the crane rail. Now, the crane in the mill, it runs like this, up and down. The cab hangs here, and the man's sitting in here, and he looks down. And there's wheels here and wheels back up here, but he's here. And that crane was one of the smaller ones. It could lift 150 tons real easy, which would be big in a lot of places. But the carpenter up there, he was working on something, and he forgot to tell the craneman, and it run over him. And it cut his head off and cut him here, and his lungs fell out and everything. My dad had to go up and take the remains down in a stretcher, a wire stretcher with a wool blanket in it. And I'm eating my lunch, and I see them lowering this mass of flesh down. It bothered me. I still kept on eating. I have a good appetite, but it didn't even turn my stomach. But I saw other things happen in that place. But you know, not long after that, there had been 2 men in that mill, and I don't know how to explain it. The open hearth floor would be here, and these big furnaces, a third of a mile long, belching out flame, and they were 250-ton capacity, but the last one was a 500-ton capacity, the one I worked on. And then you'd have the ground floor 15 foot below, and they'd put the ladle here in the back. Well, when that ladle would be full, that crane could pick up 750 tons. Because the ladle weighed a couple hundred tons too, and the steel weighed 500 tons. And just pick her right up and walk away with it, and they would pour it into molds. Well, you see then that overflow, there's always an overflow, slag coming out of that furnace. They'd have a thimble there. Well, one man fell in that, and all he found was a leg, part of a leg. He just burned up. And then the next man in the mill to fall into the pits, he fell off the back of the platform where he was working, and the furnace had been draining a long time, and there was a slab of steel about that thick, and I would say it was 15 by 30 foot, bright cherry red. He fell right on her. He worked on the next furnace to me. His name was Roy Boyette. He's a Frenchman, a scoffer, a total scoffer, and he fell on that. I was saved at the time. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'll finish this episode here. And you know, the poor man lay there just for a few moments, and a worker in the pit saw him, and he ran onto that thing with his shoes on fire, and he grabbed that big heavy man, a little fellow, and he got him off. But you know, his whole chest was burned like a burnt roast, like just a crust. And the rib was sticking out, shoulder bone was sticking out, femur bone was sticking out on his leg, and they couldn't set the bones because of the burns. And they took him to the hospital. Nobody allowed to see him but his wife. And they pumped him with morphine to try to kill the pain. That man lived like that 2 weeks. It's a miracle he lived. And his face got all puffed up. They had Vaseline on his face, and he was drowning internally from all the burns. And you know, I went to the hospital. God put it on my heart. I went there. The superintendent of the whole steel mill couldn't even get in. I went to my Bible. And I walked in, and they said, I said, I'm Robert Surgenor to see Mr. Boyette. Oh, are you his pastor? I said, yes. So I got this. And I touched him, and he says, who's there? I said, it's me, your buddy, on the next furnace, Bob. Do you know what he said? Am I going to die? Because I'd been preaching to him in the mill. Am I going to die? Terror-stricken. I said, yes, you're going to die. And he started to swear. And I tried to pump verses into him. Couldn't get to him. And you know, the nurses were, a couple days later he died, and the nurses were struck with terror. Screaming, blaspheming God at the top of his voice. He went into eternity, into a worse flame. He's there tonight. Where would you be if you died tonight? Oh, the horror of it all. The fire that shall never be quenched, where their worm dieth not. What an awful place it must be. But you know, I've been in the mill only a year, still in my sins. And when they took the ladle away, it was a miracle. The furnace never drained. It always drained. You had to drain those furnaces all the time. The first helper had the bottom dried up with raw dolomite because it drained out perfectly before we took the runner off that connected the furnace and the ladle. And not a drop came out. That's the day I fell. Knock and bone, just a piece of steel, cold steel line on the bottom, jagged steel went into my knee. And when I was taken home, my mother, she was almost hysterical. She got on my dad. Why did you get him a job in that steel mill? He could have been in hell. You see, God spared me. You know, I think of that verse, he that being often reproved. And I'll tell you, God often reproved this sinner. And then, you know, my adopted sister said, Bob, there's a real nice girl on the other side of town, plays a good guitar, and she's a nice girl. And I drank, she didn't drink. Smoked, she didn't drink. I went to picture shows, she wouldn't go to pictures. I never went to a dance, though. That was always too sissified for me. Dances, that's for sissies as far as I was concerned. But anyway, I went over there and I met her, and she was such a nice girl. And we played music. Played all that hoedowns and bluegrass, and her father played too. They were from West Virginia, you see. They were hill people. Scots-Irish background, mixed with a little Indian, American Indian and German too. So that's quite a combination. But, you know, I proposed to her. I really fell in love with this girl. Her name was Wilda, and I found out later that means the wild one. But she wasn't wild. She had 4 sisters, and I really think she was the nicest of them all. And, you know, I proposed. You know, she told me, she says, honey, I'm not a well person. I've got asthma real bad, and sometimes I rush to the hospital, and it'll only be a burden to you. She says, no, I don't want to get married. And, you know, that just, do you know what it did to me? Made me more determined than ever. And I finally got her talked into it. And then I start moving the date up. And I got it moved up to January 1st. I says, let's get married New Year's Day. Well, I don't know. Well, I says, I'll tell you what. How about Christmas? Okay, we're going to get married on Christmas. Then I thought, if I got married on my birthday, September 2nd, I'd never forget my anniversary. So that's when we got married. And I did forget it once. But I was not preaching in a new place about 350 miles from home, and I called her up at 10 at night, and we talked for about 20 minutes, and she said, you got anything else to tell me? I said, no, why? You sure you have nothing else to say? I said, no. Well, good night, honey. I said, good night. And I went in the trailer. Bill Lavery was with me. And I woke up at 1 o'clock in the morning and thought, good night, it was my birthday and my anniversary. So I called her in the morning. But anyways, we got married on my birthday. Then about 11 or 12 months later, the Lord gave us a little boy. And I'll tell you, I'll give you a little advice if anybody here is thinking of getting married and living with their folks, don't do it. That 14-room house was not big enough for 2 women. Because my mother had a spin dryer washer. She'd had the thing 20 years, or 25 years, I think. No, 20 years. And we bought it for $25, and it broke a month later, and my mother said to my wife, my dear wife, girl, you know how the English can be. Girl, I had that washer 20 years, and you broke it in a month. The thing was wore out. And my dad, in his Irish way, says, well, boy, says, you're between the devil and the deep blue sea. So he looked for us for a house, clean on the other side of town, 30 miles on the other side of Cleveland, on the west side. And we saw an old house, and I didn't have the money. I bought a brand new car and paid cash for it, a big Buick car, and then got married, and we didn't have enough for a down payment. So my dad loaned it to me. And we got this house. Well, I'll tell you, I was dismayed. We weren't in that house a couple of weeks, and at the door, he's my old Sunday school teacher, Jim Lipke, and he was out in the Lord's work, and he said, I'd like you to come to hear me preach. I'm home for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, and the hall's just around the corner. I thought, oh, good night. We bought a house right around the corner from a gospel hall on the other side of town. I thought that was terrible. A 10-minute walk. So we went, and the first night he preached. And my wife going out said, I enjoyed that. You know. And she'd never heard of pure gospel, you know. And I said to her, you know, you just insulted that man, telling him that you enjoyed it. He wants you to be so miserable you feel like crawling. That's what he wants. Bob, I just meant he helped me. Well, we went back the next week. And here's a woman that was about as clean a living, unsaved person as you could find. And he preached, we're all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousness is our filthy rags. Then he went to Romans, let God be true, but every man a liar. She went home that night convicted. And I went to work. I was on the night shift, 11 to 7 that week. The next morning, while she was cleaning the stove, the gas stove, with a rag in her hand and cleaning the burners, that verse hit her. And she looked at that rag, and she says, that's all my good life. Filthy rags. And then her pride said, not a bit of it. You're better than that filthy rag. Then the next verse hit her, you see. Let God be true, but every man a liar. And she thought, I'm calling God a liar if I deny that all my good works is no more than this filthy rags as far as God's concerned. And she got afraid that she'd called God a liar. She started crying to God to have mercy on her, standing there at the stove. You know what happened? God revealed to her that Christ died for sinners. And she got saved, receiving him right standing there at the stove with an old dirty rag in her hand. And she called Mr. Lipke up, and he come over. Of course, I'm upstairs sleeping. And he come over. She said, she had told him, he usually gets up at 1 o'clock. I'd go to bed at 8 and get up at 1. That was it on the night shift. He come over, but I'll tell you, I heard him. I didn't come downstairs. He hung around. I thought, when's that fellow going to leave? Then he left. I thought, I'm not going down yet. He might go around the block and come back again. So I waited about 15 more minutes, sure that the coast was clear. I come down and poured me a beer. I made my own beer, because I was drinking in the summer about 6 quarts a day. Wintertime was cold. You only drink about 3 or 4 quarts a day. Not terrible. You see the mill in the back, when we put the heat in the ladle, it went to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot. We had to wear long underwear to keep. blue jeans from burning our legs. And then we wore wool overcoat to keep the heat off. Wear a wool overcoat to keep the heat off of you, not to keep the heat in. And the coolest place in the mill was 120 degrees, and that was out front. But at any rate, when I come downstairs, I had a beer for breakfast, and I went to work that night, and I'm leaving at 9:30. And she looked at me, she says, "Do you see anything different about me?" I said, "You're saved, aren't you?" She said, "Yes, I am." And you know what the thought struck me? I lived all these years in a Christian home and had to go to meetings. And I finally got liberated. And I got me a wife. I got my own house. And now I'm stuck with one. I'm married to one. Isn't that awful? And out the door I went and down the street, spinning my wheels. I was so angry. Yet, deep inside, I was glad she was saved. And the next week, the Spirit of God was helping my man, because one thing that scared me a lot was the Lord's coming. That's what he preached on that night, the coming of the Lord. And dread filled my soul. I have to close in 3 minutes. Dread filled my soul. I went home that night, and I was scheduled the next morning to go out. Leave at 5 o'clock, 5:30 in the morning. I started to cry. And the thought struck me, I've had it. I'm lost. And she said, "Bob, what's the matter?" That bed was shaking. It was midnight, like the jailer. I wasn't in jail. I was married, but I wasn't in jail. But at any rate, there I was. She said, "What's the matter?" I says, "Nothing. Go to sleep, will you?" And it kept on. And finally she says, "Bob, what's your problem?" I said, "Honey, you heard the gospel 2 times. Got saved. And I've heard it all my life. I'm not saved yet." Well, let me tell you what happened between the time she got saved and I got saved. After she was saved, I went to work. I don't know if it was that night or the next night. And I got a tow motor truck stuck on the ramp between the 2 furnaces, and I got that big crane to lower its hook. And the block on that crane was as big as this here, and that thick steel, and the hook was this thick, big hook like this, to hook on the back of the big ladle. I drew a picture of it on my conversion tract, of that hook pouring the steel into the furnace. That's pouring the pig iron in the furnace to make the steel later. And you know that I had that crayman, and he's pulling on that tow motor on an angle to pull it up the little ramp between the furnaces, and I'm directing them. And the cable slipped off the truck, and the hook started to swing like a pendulum. And I heard a man over at the bench, my co-worker, he hollered. And I turned to see who was hollering, and when I turned, that big hook nipped my ear. And if I hadn't turned, it would have hit my head. And if it had hit my head, it would have knocked it off my shoulders. I know that. There's no give to something like that. And you know, Proverbs 29, I heard it audibly. Now you might think that's strange, eh? I heard these words. He that being often reproved hardeneth his neck shall suddenly be destroyed, not without remedy. And the worker said, "Hey, come here, Surgenor." Bunch of ungodly men in the mill. I walked over there, a trembling soul. I said, "Are you baptized?" He says, "No." Boy, if it hit your head, you'd have been shoveling coal in hell right now. And they started laughing at me. It's like the laughter of fiends. I stood there just stunned. And I knew it wasn't because I wasn't baptized, because I wasn't born again. Then my helper said, I was under him at that time, he said, "Let's get a test out of the furnace." And I walked over to that furnace, 125 foot wide, 40 foot this way, of molten steel bubbling at 2,800 degrees. And the flame roaring across that bath, 700 gallons an hour. 80 mile an hour, big flame roaring. And I looked in there, and I'll tell you, I thought, oh God, I was almost there. Almost there. Went home that morning. That ended my drinking. Couldn't drink. I could hardly eat. I couldn't do my work. The rest of the week, hardly at all. And when I went that night and he preached on the Lord's coming, it was just too much. You know what my wife said? I said to her, I've heard the gospel all my life. Not saved. I think God, and He saved you, and He hasn't saved me yet, and I don't think I'll ever be saved. He's left me. I've played the fool. Well, you see, I was lost then, wasn't I? I was lost. And she got her Bible. My mother had bought her a new Bible. And she read different verses out of the Gospel of John. I couldn't tell you what she read. And finally she said, Bob, the reason you're not saved is you're afraid to trust His blood to put your sins away. His blood can put your sins away. Imagine, saved 6 days. A woman preacher. And you know, that was one time it paid me to really listen to my wife. And I said to her, is that all there is to it? And she said, that's all. And I thought, well, that's all, that's what it'll do. I'll just believe His blood can cleanse me. And I said to her, I'm saved. And she says, how do you know? I says, because I did what you told me. I don't know if that answer would satisfy a lot of brethren. I just did what you told me. And it was midnight, and I called my dad, and my dad, he had a nice way of answering the phone. No matter who called, the phone rang, the other end, here's what I heard. Yeah! I says, Dad, I'm saved. And you know, they were laying in bed, and my mother says, I don't think my boy's ever going to get saved. He says, God's got His hook in him. It won't be long now, and you'll be hearing he's saved. You know, Mr. Work told her that when I was in my teens. He said, you remember that prayer? You asked God to spare him. God's going to save that boy someday. That'd give her a little assurance, dear Mr. Work. Got my mother on the phone. She just broke down in tears. And you know, in 1963, I laid down those tools of work and went out full time for the Lord. And my mother lived to see me go out in the Lord's work. But one day I got a phone call. Says, you better get down here if you want to see your mother. She's gone. I went down. And we walked in the hospital that day. He took one look at her. He says, Nan, you're going home. Her face was gray. I make a long story short. I had my left hand under her and my right hand embracing her. You know what she said? She took a heart attack. The last one. And looking up into my face, she said, Robert, first she said, oh Lord, please take me home. She said that 6 times. And then looking at me, she said, Robert, my son, goodbye. Gone. Died in my arms. But you know what? I'm going again. But most blessed of all, I'm going to see the man that died for a sinner like me. Maybe there's somebody here and you've got a mother and father and they've prayed for you. And they're going to go home to heaven someday. Will you ever see them again? If you're not saved, let me tell you, take the Savior tonight. Believe that He died for you and He'll take you in. For God says, this man receiveth sinners. Shall we pray?